Perched at the top of my Polyomino mountain of fame is Isle of Cats, Barron Park, New York Zoos, among others. But there's a new kid on the block. They just showed up at my local game store. After seeing Wild Tiled West on all the Gen Con previews, I was already suffering from an avalanche of Gen Con FOMO. When I saw it, I just had to have it. Our family loves Polyomino games. It was one of our earliest entries to the modern board gaming space, and when a new one comes out, we try it. For the most part, I've been pretty successful. The only one that I've gotten rid of was 10 Penny Parks. Not my favorite. And Wild Tiled West is doing something new. But is it enough to catapult it to my Polyomino Mount Rushmore? Well, let's find out. First, let's talk a little bit about what Wild Tiled West is. Wild Tiled West is a tile placement game. Like many of its predecessors, you grab Polyomino tiles, place them on the board, score points. Most points at the end of the game wins. Simple. The game takes course over 4 years, and within those years, there's multiple rounds. Each round is comprised of each player taking one Polyomino piece and placing it on their board. At the end of each round, there's a tussle phase. During that phase, you're measuring the number of banded icons on your board compared to others. The person with the most loses points. The person with the least gains points. Simple as that. There are ways to mitigate these icons, but we'll talk about that later. Before we get into the core of placing the tiles and the nuances related to placing those tiles, we first have to talk a little bit about the tile selection board. There's 4 boards that I absolutely love. They're double layered. They hold all the Polyomino pieces. Super easy to set up the game. You just pull them out of the box and they're ready. The board is comprised of a river running through a prairie. Some tiles are associated with the river, other tiles associated with the prairie. Before we go into the distinction of those two areas, let's talk a little about how you're able to draft these tiles. At the beginning of each round, the first player rolls a number of die. Those numbers correspond to these places on the board. You place the die into each space. Then each player is allowed to draft a tile that's adjacent to one of these die. If in the river, you can pay 1 gold per space to move down the river and take a totally different tile. It's also important to note that some of these tiles have a gold cost associated with them, so you also have to pay that gold cost if you want some of these tiles. And in the prairie spaces, you can't pay the gold to move over. The only way that you're moving over to the next column is if the first space is empty. This limitation on selecting the tile reminds me a little bit of the New York Zoo mechanic. There's the elephant moving around the rondelle, and depending on where it lands will limit the pieces that you can actually take. I like this better than kind of the random draw of Isle of Cats. You draw a tile out and you have to deal with the consequences of where they land. You can at least see what is available. I really like this dice selection mechanic. Yes, it is random, but it makes you think and make really important decisions as to what you're going to select and where you're going to place it. You can't really have a full plan of what you're going to do. It's that new information coming at you all the time that's going to keep it fresh. And before we go into the specific tiles and what they do and all of the scoring, we first have to get into your player board. The game comes with a bunch of these player boards. They are double-sided. One side has kind of a asymmetric wrinkle that I'll let you discover on your own. We play with it. It's really cool, but they're all comprised differently. Each board has a number of symbols out on the board, some of which, if you cover, you get that thing. Whether it be an alley, which is simply a little square piece that will plug in for all of those pesky open spots you just have to fill. You can also get gold pieces, which we already mentioned are very important when trying to get the right tile, especially if you want one that costs a couple of gold. You can also get these pickaxes. I'll draw your attention to the sideboard. It's the mining track. It essentially will say how much gold that you get as income between each year. You start with a baseline of 2 and go up from there depending on how many of these pickaxes that you cover. Also, if you go high enough, there are in-game points associated with them. And lastly, you can cover these bullets. We're going to put a pin in the bullets really quickly. That's going to come into place when we start to talk about the different tiles, and we'll go a little deeper into their significance. There's also things like mines and mountains that are barriers that you essentially have to play around. The mines are associated with the pickaxes we already talked about. The last symbol that you can't cover are cows. Those will connect with other tiles that you're going to be able to place, and we'll talk about that significance when we get to the tiles in just 1 second. I have one more form of housekeeping that's actually a really big point, and it's where you're going to score a significant amount of your point. You'll see on the board there's town names that circle it, and next to each of those town names there's points associated, and right next to those are different colored tiled sections. When you fill out that section, you're essentially completing a town. When you complete the town, you get the associated points. You also get bonus points depending on what year you're in. The earlier the year, the more points you're going to get. Obviously, if you can, you want to try to knock those out as soon as possible. So now tile types. You're going to find a couple different tile types. Buildings, which there's a variety of those and we'll get into. You'll find roads and pastures. In pastures, which are the green spaces, you'll find these cows. Now the cows are a really important part of scoring. You're essentially trying to group those cows, and the more cows you can get in a continuous group, the more points you're going to score. At any time, you can choose to wrangle those cows. You're going to put a cow poke or a boot token on those cows, signifying that that section is done, and you'll lock those points in. Once you've done that, you can't add any more cows to it and score more points. You have to basically create a totally separate pasture with cows in them. This is another large portion of your score and something you're really going to also want to focus on. And the other symbols that you're going to find on these are the bandits, which we already talked about, but then also the mitigation to those bandits, which are sheriffs. We talked about picking up bullets when you place tiles on top of them. Those bullets are what sheriffs use to knock out the bandits. And the way they do that, after a sheriff is placed, at any time, if he's in line sight of a bandit and you have the bullets, you can use that bullet, turn it on its side, turn it into a tombstone, and that bandit's done. You don't have to deal with it. Then you don't have to count them against you during the tussle. Each one of these tombstones that you have is 2 points at the end of the game, so another point source. The really interesting part is I said line sight. So think about it logically. What can you shoot through? Can you shoot through a mountain? Can you shoot through a cow? Can you shoot, well, technically, I guess, but can you shoot through buildings? You know, all those things you can't actually shoot through, so that's not line sight. A really interesting wrinkle to this game is that when you're placing the sheriffs to try to neutralize the bandits, you can't have anything in between them. You really have to think about placing something like a building in between, because once you acquire a bullet, you won't be able to take the bandit out. So it's just another thinky wrinkle where you're not just trying to find the polyomino pieces to fit, you need them to fit at the right time, and also make sure you're getting the bullets to be able to take out the bandit. There's also some bonuses in the game that we'll talk about later that'll even give you extra points for having very few bandits, or having sheriffs out on each town, or even having more tombstones. So now what's left to go over are the buildings. So you'll find red buildings that once you surround all adjacent sides, you get the bonus. It could be things like points, extra resources like bullets and pickaxes, or even gold. There's blue buildings that will get you a bonus like bullets. Pink buildings are in-game scoring criteria. I had mentioned earlier you can get more points for those tombstones. You're already getting 2 points, but in the example of the chapel, you're getting an extra point per tombstone on your board. Then there's the yellow buildings that give you an ongoing effect throughout the game, like the barn, where every time you wrangle a cow, you get gold. These really help with the variety. When a die gets next to those, you really want to make sure that you're paying attention. You may never get another chance to get something like the chapel again, and if you've been knocking out a bunch of the bandits, that's a bunch of points you'd be passing up. Another great way to score points is with the partner cards. Everyone starts with a partner card that they choose out of 2. These will essentially give you in-game scoring conditions. You can also get another one of these partner cards as you go up the mining track. There's nothing new about the partner cards. You know, tons of games do the in-game scoring, but in this game, it's a really great way to help direct where you want to specialize. Because one thing I noticed on this, there's no way to get all of your towns filled up, which is a little unsatisfying. I feel like I can get to maybe 2 towns as I'm playing. Maybe I'm awful at games. That could totally be true, but I'm definitely not getting close to filling up that board. And it may give me a directive, like getting a sheriff in towns for bonus points. And the more towns I have a sheriff in, the more points you get. That alone can drive the strategy through the entire game. In fact, some of these cards could be 10 to 20, 25% of your entire score if you maximize them. So let's talk a little bit about the components. The good double layered tile trays are awesome. Anything double layer, I'm totally in on. Wooden bits are always nice. Kind of a pro and a con is the insert. The insert in general is great. Everything fits in there really tightly. It's nicely designed. I would say for the little bits, the cowpokes, the gold, and the bullets, I'd love for those to be removable. Instead, you have to scoop them out each time and throw them on the table. Not a huge deal, but just a tiny oversight. The one big negative for me, and this honestly goes for most Polyomino games, are these really thin kind of player boards. I mean, they're barely cardboard, really. There's like 8 of these boards, and if they were full cardboard, it would take up a lot of space. I would love a Polyomino game that is dual layered. Just things fitting in there and staying tight would be really great. Instead, as we all know, if you played a Polyomino game, they're sliding all over the place. You bump the table. Oh, I don't know where that stuff went, but it's a minor annoyance that I honestly can't think of a game that does it much better. And for me, this last con is a little bit subjective. The art to me is just okay. It's nothing that really gets me excited. It's cartoony, it's fine. Some people may love it, But for me, you know, I could take it or leave it. It doesn't really detract from the game for me. Like, there is definitely some art there that totally detracts from the game. This is fine. So final thoughts here. My pros, it's a Polyomino game. I love Polyomino games. This is totally personal and subjective, but those are always a pro for me. Selecting and laying tiles is deeper than just making them fit. As we went over, there's a lot of layers to scoring. There's a lot of things to think about when you're laying a tile, like a sheriff and the bandit interaction in and of itself are important. If you're trying to surround that town hall tile to get the 10 points at the end of the game, that's going to drive your actions. Trying to string those cows together as long as you can in the continuous pasture is yet another wrinkle that just makes that tile placement a little more interesting than in other Polyomino games. And the partners give you sort of an asymmetric goal to go after and will help to drive strategy otherwise. So for the cons, I guess for me, this first con is a pro and a con. It's another one that's kind of like on the border there. There is some rules overhead, and most Polyomino games are known for their simplicity, just placing tiles and having fun. This isn't that. This is a kind of like Polyomino plus in my mind. So if you were wanting to use this as an entry-level game for a new board gamer, I probably wouldn't start there. I'd probably start somewhere like New York Zoo or Barron Park. But on the other hand, it's a pro. That's what, you know, being a seasoned board gamer, you start to get bored of that stuff, and having these layers of complexity are a major plus. Once again, the player boards are a little bit rough. I'd like to see a little better quality there. And once again, the art theme is okay. Overall, not many cons though. So I guess the big question is, where does it rank on my Mount Rushmore of Polyomino game? I think it might actually be on the Mount Rushmore. I'm personally probably sitting with Isle of Cats at the top of that mountain right now. This might be actually taking second place. Once I get my Planet Unknown pledge, I have a feeling it might bounce to third and Planet Unknown might go to the top. From a Polyomino progression, if I'm a brand new board gamer, I'm starting with Barron Park and New York Zoo, and then moving on to Isle of Cats probably, and then ending here. Because of that layered complexity, this is definitely a next step in your board game journey after you've played those more basic Polyomino games. So overall, if you're a Polyomino fiend like we are, yeah, you're gonna buy it, of course. Like you have to try it out. Or if you're a seasoned board gamer that doesn't love Polyomino because they're typically fairly simple, this may be something you want to try, because those layers of complexity and scoring will keep it a little bit fresh, as well as the variable player boards and that aforementioned other side of the player board where there's an asymmetric wrinkle to the game. If you've made it this far, maybe think about subscribing. I'm just getting started. I have a ton more content planned for this channel. I'm going to keep pumping it out here. I'd love to hear your feedback, maybe any other games that you'd like to see coverage on. And on that note, thanks for watching, and I'm out.